Hello, let's talk about debiasing strategies. So we've had some discussion about critical thinking and cognitive biases and the pitfalls of narrative fallacies and so on, but how do we actually avoid those things? I've mentioned that we need to try and avoid those biases, but how do we do that? So I've been working on a 4-point plan. And basically, you're already doing a lot of the things that we need to do. But I think it's important that we understand that that's part of the reason for doing them. So in the first instance, we need to clearly understand the problem. So we've been talking a lot about that in terms of our background research and defining our aims and objectives and thinking of all the possible methods and data that we might use to solve the problem. We then have to look at our knowledge development and management. So we've talked about how do we learn? What do we learn? How do we do our research? And once we've gathered the information, how do we internalize it or store it or manage it for recall? And how do we approach trying to consider again all of the possibilities? So not just a blinkered focus on one area, but consider all of the possible explanations for our observations. So there's a whole phase of knowledge development and management and skills associated with that we need to develop. Then, once we have the knowledge and we know what the problem is, we need to apply the knowledge to the problem. So that's our scientific reasoning, our logical argumentation and hypothesis testing and so on, and all of those critical thinking skills that we'll cover in the next presentation. And then finally, of course, we've already talked about communicating the outcomes. So how do we finally present or illustrate the results of our studies? So each of these 4 stages in the process, each of them is designed to help you overcome the biases, to clearly define the problem, clearly research all eventualities, to test all possible hypotheses and so on and so forth, and put in place all kinds of mechanisms to help us avoid confirmation bias and anchoring bias and so on and so forth. So how do we actually take responsibility for that? Well, in the first instance, we could modify ourselves, modify the decision maker. And yes, we can do that to a certain extent, and we're doing that now by recognizing cognitive biases, becoming more familiar with those biases, and learning to challenge our own biases, so to step back and think about how we're thinking and think about what we know and why we know it and whether or not we're considering everything. But we also need to be prepared to be challenged by others, because part of the debiasing process is not only to recognize the biases in your own thinking, which is actually very difficult, but to recognize it in others, which is much easier. So in order to debias your own thinking, you need to invite others to debias it for you, because it will be easier for them to see where your biases lie. And of course, if you actually engage in the development and the application of best practices through the documentation of methods and workflows and the definition of the standards and so on that we've talked about, then that is also contributing to your understanding and limitations of your thinking. However, for the most part, we can't really rely on all the individuals in an organization to take that initiative and to take that responsibility. And if you remember the Dunning-Kruger bias, it's very likely that the people who are most susceptible to biases are potentially also the ones who are least likely to be able to recognize it. So we have to put in place processes within organizations to help us overcome those biases. So the second choice is to modify the environment. So we change the working environment so that decision makers are guided down certain paths and ask appropriate questions at appropriate times and make appropriate decisions And we've already looked at this. We've looked at workflows, we've looked at processes, we've looked at decision points within those analytical processes where we should always ask these critical questions in order to ensure that we are not missing anything and we're not biased in the way we're working. So create those work practices, encourage consistent recognition of the biases and systematic implementation of the debiasing methods. So that's a large, in large part, that's why we have all of these processes and these workflows documented, in order to learn from the mistakes we make caused largely by our biases and to avoid them the next time round. And that's what quality management systems are. I've mentioned these before. A quality management system is a system which ensures that we follow the best practices and the defined standards and so on within our quality manual. Now, you're not going to get much experience of that when you're working on a dissertation at a sort of graduate or postgraduate level, but it's certainly a large part of what we do in industry in order to maintain standards across a large organization. We need to capture the best practices, we need to disseminate them, is what I'm trying to say, and we need to have a system which ensures that they are being disseminated and that there is compliance. So this is a big thing in industry. And part of that, I'm sure you will be exposed to some of this. For example, peer reviews. So when you make a presentation to your peers and they offer constructive criticism, that is part of the process for ensuring that your interpretation is not biased and that you haven't missed out part of the story, or you haven't been anchored to one idea when your results could equally be explained by some other means. So that in itself is part of the debiasing process. And to overcome that planning fallacy as well, we've already talked about, we've mentioned timesheets. That's another part of the working environment which is designed to help us overcome these biases and fallacies. So just to put it into context here, we can see all of the steps in that knowledge development and management, the research, the learning, the knowledge management and the testing of our knowledge. Those are the things we're doing. We're back to that metacognition, is stepping back and not just researching and learning because that's what you've been told to do, but understanding why you're researching and learning and how you're researching and learning and so on. So just take a step back and think about how you're doing that and think about how you can improve those skills. And also don't forget about being creative and imaginative. Those are important elements of the process as well. Then, of course, we need to apply all of that knowledge to the problem. So our analytical and our problem-solving processes, our scientific reasoning and our logical argumentation, those are all the skills we employ to apply that broad knowledge to our well-defined problem. And then ultimately, we need to communicate the outcomes. That may be through a report or a presentation or a video or an animation, and we need to think about exactly who that audience is. And in the case of a dissertation, who is your audience? Is it your supervisor or is it your examiner? Certainly in the first instance, those two are very important, particularly the examiner. And speaking as an examiner who's examined a lot of theses, I'm interested in finding something which is interesting and readable and has a clear narrative flow and is well organized. I don't want to have to work too hard to understand what you've been doing, why you've been doing it, and how you did it. So think about the examiner for sure if you're writing a dissertation. But also, if you're writing a professional report for a client, you've got to think about your client, think about what they know, what they understand. And if you're providing expert opinion on something, are they experts in your field? And more often than not, they aren't. So you have to consider how you're pitching your ideas. Because if they don't get it, if they don't get something out of it, if they don't understand what you're telling them, they probably won't come back and commission any more work from you. So it is really very important to know your audience. And are you supplying information, or do you want to engage some kind of emotional stigma to engage them in the content? Or is it in some way a motivational piece? Are you trying to communicate something to encourage people to think or do something in a certain way? So again, there's a lot to consider when you're designing your communication strategy. Communicating the outcomes we've seen already in our report planning. We need to clearly communicate our aims and objectives, our data availability and quality, analytical methods, scientific reasoning, conclusions, and also at the end of the process we should have some kind of wash-up, some kind of post-mortem to learn the lessons, what worked, what didn't work. Get that feedback from your supervisor, your examiner, your client, whoever the audience may be, and learn from it and act on it. So there's a whole host of skills in there, the things that we're not just doing in order to complete the report. Those activities and those processes are all designed as well to help us avoid bias and improve our thinking and make our problem solving more focused. So hopefully that's helpful to you. A frame of reference there, a 4-point plan, dividing these skills and activities up into sets, so you can think about which of these skills you have under each of those 4 headings and just how much more you could achieve if you can develop those skills further. Okay, so that's a little bit about debiasing, hopefully putting it in the context of your dissertation and your studies and your report writing and so on, and hopefully giving you a better idea why so many of these things are done this way. And it's for a whole variety of reasons, so just hopefully make you more aware of that. Thank you again for listening. Once again, any comments, throw a comment into the forum and we'll pick up the discussion from there. Thanks and bye for now.